everybody, and welcome to another hobby cheating video. And today we are doing an end-to-end paint of a model. So what's happening here that you see is I recorded every second of me painting this model. So you can see basically what I do and every choice I make, and I'm going to talk through kind of what I'm doing at every point in time. Now I've already started this rolling because it's really long. Like, I'm going to be honest with you. Tuck in, folks, because this is going to take a while. So what I'm painting here is the Skaven Deathrunner from the Silver Tower box set. It's a great model. There's a huge amount of detail on him. He's really cool, and it's a chance to try out a lot of great techniques. So I thought what I would do is record more or less every second of me painting. And then, do this, talk you through. So, it's actually about 95% of what I did is recorded here, because some of it I had to be in like really direct light. Some of it I had to kind of, very, very carefully take the model up and bring it close to me and stuff like that. And the position I have to hold it here so you can actually see what's going on is not the most comfortable thing I've ever done. I'll say that. Okay. So, preamble out of the way. What are we doing? All right, so, I started just by base coating. You can see I've got my Scale 75 flesh set out. And so I started with sort of a nice mix that I liked, which was a little bit of the basic flesh tone, plus the Arabic shadow, plus just a little bit of the light flesh. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why did you mix both the light and a shadow together? It's because I wanted to kill out some of the pink. The basic flesh was a little more pink than I wanted in this particular build for the majority of his body. I wanted the tail to stand out as being a little more pink, so hence I wanted to sort of neutralize some of that. What I'm doing right now is then I took some of that darker Indian shadow and mixed it with the Arabic shadow and a bit of the basic flesh, and I started working in glazes. So what I was doing here over the past couple moments was actually just starting to outline all the muscles, work in deeper shadows, and you can see I hit some of the shadows multiple times. It's a thinner glaze that I work these paints down into. So the key is you kind of apply it to everything, you see what happens, you go back, you deepen some shadows, and you keep working it. So once all the muscles were sort of well defined and I had my initial shadows placed, the next step was to take some of the very pale flesh along with some of the light and start cutting out some highlights. So I didn't go straight to like the lightest color flesh. I still mixed in with some of my base tone. This whole time I'm just kind of working these shades up and down on my palette. And I'm just kind of picking out the tops of muscles, applying my highlights, stuff like that. Now, you'll notice at the beginning here, I am doing the tail at the same time, but I know that I'm going to apply a lot of other colors to the tail. What I'm really doing with the tail is just working in a lot of different colors. So I'm just kind of, every layer I do, or every time I add more color to this model, I just put some more on the tail how I like it. So that way the tail is very organically a darker pink color. So like I leave off certain highlights, I apply certain shades heavier, that kind of thing. Because I don't want to go back at the tail at the end and wash it all. That really stands out, and it's way, 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 way stronger than I wanted. So the key was to just start slowly work those colors in. And I'm leaving a lot of the darker recesses in between the same. So now what I'm doing here is it's time. So with the initial highlights placed, the initial shadows placed over the base, the next step is bringing it all together. So we go back to various ranges of our midtone from, moving up to just slightly darker than the lightest and slightly lighter than the darkest. And we begin just working those glazes in, just working them over and over and over again. And that's really the key. If you want to get those hyper smooth flesh tones, you've got to just start working in those glazes over and over again. I'm also building up my highlights very carefully. So once I bring everything back down, like I'll sometimes glaze over the whole highlight just to kind of smooth it all back out. Then I go back up to a higher color. And you might say, well, why didn't you just leave it on there? Because I want a hyper smooth blend on this skin, right? And if you're going to walk a massive transition down, which I am here, because if you look at those 5 paints, that's going from a deep, almost crimson color all the way up to an almost white pale flesh. That's a lot of space to walk in a short amount of area. And the only way you get there is by lots and lots, and have it be smooth, I should say, is by having lots and lots of glazes that are applied over and over again, and you just sort of naturally, organically build up that color. And the key is when you re-highlight, you don't always start at the same place. So what you get is lots of different layers intersecting with each other, where the light is being diffused all over the model at slightly different points. That's what fools the eye into that hyper smooth glaze, that hyper smooth transition from the lightest to the darkest. Okay, so I'm just continuing to do that. So the key is I'll grab some of the darker color, and I tend to work on like a set of muscles at a time. So I'll go into a darker color. I'll sort of, test that out, see how dark that got it, move up just slightly, bring in a slight dab of the lighter color, another slight dab of the lighter color, and then I'll do it again and work up, and then I'll thin out one of the midtones and glaze over everything I just did. I'm just glazing over it. That's the key. Not eliminating it, just muting it down, keeping the transitions nice and smooth, just working it over and over and over again. You'll notice, by the way, I'm painting like hyper fast here in this image. I hope you don't think this is the actual speed I paint at. I'm not like a robot or something from Alien doing the knife game real fast. Aliens. No, this is obviously this is played back at 8 times speed because this was about 7.5 hours or something of footage. It was a lot, so I didn't really think that having you sit and stare at me doing this for 7.5 hours would be the most productive use of your time. So hence, this is at 8 times speed. So when I work my highlights, what I'm doing here is, especially on the very finer details, I build them up very slowly and organically through lots of thin glazes. So take, for example, the fingertips, or the edge of the nose, or the knuckles, or something like that, right? You want those to really stand out. But if you just go on and slap a bright color on there real thick, it's just going to be way too stark. So instead, what I do is, as I'm working them around, I'll just hit each knuckle with a very thin glaze. And then I'll keep working on other sections. And then I'll hit each knuckle with a thin glaze. And then I'll kind of go into a mid-tone. I'll grab from the other side of it, and I smooth it back out again. The other key of what I'm doing here in between every so often is stopping, and I take the model and I just stare at it for a minute. You don't see me doing it much because I tend to do it in between cuts. This isn't obviously a 6.5 hour straight session or something. But this is a very, very important step when you're trying to get these very smooth glazes over everything and working a model like this. You stop, you take the model back, you bring it up to your face, you turn it around slowly, and you look at everything, not just the areas, because it's easy when you're applying lots of paint like this over and over again. Like there, I just did it real fast. To sort of hone in on a few areas and then miss something, right? And when that happens, you can get very far and deep into this process, and then all of a sudden go, oh, crap, I never painted this one particular thing just because you never noticed it. I've done this on like Skaven's ears. Oh my God, more times than I can count. So, the key is when you're working like this, make sure you stop, walk away, or, go refresh yourself, come back, turn the model around slowly in your hand, and make sure that you're getting every area of the model that is this particular color, especially when you're working in so many layers. Because if you miss something, you're suddenly way behind the curve. Right, and you're gonna have to rebuild up all your transitions over and over again, and keeping them, really well aligned could become very difficult at that point. You'll notice I'm still doing flesh, by the way, and we're almost 10 minutes into this. You can do the math at 8 times speed. I think all told, it was about 2.5, 3 hours of working just that main body flesh tone. That's not counting the tail. Which is pretty good. This guy doesn't have a huge amount of flesh. It would certainly be more if I was working on, say, like a Kingdom Death Mini or something that's mostly naked, because there you really have to work it. I was able to do this in about 3 hours and be happy with the blend, because one, his muscles are extremely well defined, and that's generally easier than doing just a huge flat space. When you've got these, like if you've just got big exposed flesh and it's just lots of open areas without definition, you've got to work those transitions much more naturally without the model to guide you. You've got to figure out kind of in place where you want those shadows to occur, where you want those natural tonal shifts to be happening. And so without the model creating any natural shadow of its own, it's a lot more difficult. So with this one, like I said, it's about 3 hours on the skin, and that's honestly pretty good. Now, he's got a lot of armor on and stuff like that, and that made it a lot easier. Still working flesh, still the same 5 colors. It's fun. I'll talk about kind of why I chose this particular tone for him. So for Skaven flesh tones, they really are more or less human flesh tones. If you're talking about not the fur. So I like to keep them in the human spectrum just a little darker and tan, hence why I leaned heavily on that Arabic brown, which is like a sort of, I don't know what, it's a brown, but it's a very sort of dusty brown. It's a nice neutral drab brown. I'm not sure what to tell you the equivalent color is in other paint ranges. It's honestly, in Vallejo, it's very close to like their dark flesh tone, I guess. But I don't know what the Citadel equivalent is. So right now, you can see that I've kind of moved to working some more detail on the tail. Again, I'm just trying to buy myself advanced work when I'm doing other things. So what I grabbed is some sort of dark liner here, and I'm working it into the ridges in between the tail where it's most appropriate. Recutting the sort of tail sections. And that's just in between having that darker color where I'm going in and redefining some of the very, very deepest shadows. Because where, say, his lower leg is cut right into his, loincloth, I guess, or something. That's completely hidden from the light and underneath and fading into the tabard. And so you want that kind of thing to go very dark so that way it stands out. You want the areas in between material transitions, flesh under armor, flesh next to armor, those kinds of things, to have a very dark, sort of a darkness to it. This is often achieved through like black lining and stuff. A lot of people go that direction, and it's perfectly fine. The more organic way to do it that takes a lot more time is to work a very small but strong and subtle transition up under the armor plate. So it's like you're slowly working very dark reds to almost deep purple right there up under the armor plate, so it looks like there's a small but diffuse shadow right there. Okay, so there we go, flesh done. So now what I did, you can see I've got a new color palette here. By the way, I'm trying to show the paints that I have as best I can on my palette every time. So now we've moved to a set of various scale 75 crimson colors, and then a Vallejo dark wash, and a gray color that I absolutely love. It's a slight purplish tone gray, which makes it perfect as a highlight color for this red. So now I'm working on his cloth clothing, and I wanted it to stand out, so I wanted it to be red. I knew that the armor here was going to be green, and red is a nice color to stand against that. But I didn't want to do a normal red because my green armor was going to be a non-metallic turquoise. So I wanted to go with the crimson because those shades play much nicer off each other. When you got the crimson color is more in a red-purple, which is going to play better against that turquoise opacity as far as a contrasting color goes. So we started just with a base coat of the mid-tone, nothing too magical there. Then I started, again, working in the deep shadows. So I moved down into the very darker, almost plum color, and then I even started bringing in some of the Vallejo dark gray model wash to really get those shadows, because some of his tabard is like way tucked under him. So I wanted that to be very, very dark, cast, almost completely in shadow. The reason I used the gray as a highlight color, as opposed to this sort of gray-purple color, the reason I picked that as what I wanted to use to build my highlight up is because it wouldn't turn the crimson pink. It would instead, it would sort of diffuse and lighten the existing crimson if used in moderate amounts. And that's the key. If you touch any kind of red with white, with true pure white, you get pink instantly. Like, it's just what happens. So when you're working up red highlights, a lot of people tend to just go to orange, but that's not always accurate. First of all, red cloth doesn't really turn orange. I mean, if it's in very direct sunlight, it'll start to get, if it's in direct yellow warm light, it will look somewhat orange. But if you take a red cloak all the way out to like an orangey yellow, that's really over highlighting. And it begins to, like, you're getting into a cartoony thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a very sort of cartoony paint scheme. What I needed here was a way to lighten the crimson while still retaining its basic crimson color. So in this case, that purple gray has the purple to tone that out, to keep it still in that red tone. And what I'm doing is just making a lighter crimson without drifting into the pink territory. So the technique here is much the same. This is a much smaller area, but I started by working in the very deep shadows, and then working out the highlights with the gray tone, and then using the mid-tone reds to smooth it all together. This was much quicker because, A, there's a lot less space, so that's one, and two, because red is naturally an extremely translucent color, so even in this crimson, the blending was, pretty fast and easy. When you can bring everything together with your mid-tone glazes pretty fast. So nothing too challenging there. That was really pretty straightforward component of this. All right, so now we move on to the fur. So with the fur, he doesn't have a lot of fur, honestly. Like, this guy's mostly skin. But there is some fur there. There's some patches of fur. So for this, you can see I've went to a Vallejo Sepia ink, a Vallejo flat brown, and the Scale 75 Calamari orange. Oh, by the way, I always keep white on my palette, so sometimes I'll be mixing white in when doing my highest highlights. The paint's never sitting out. It's just there's always clean white on my palette, so it's just good. It's just a good color to have around when you're needing highlights. So you might see a couple different whites that pop up every so often, but it's never the main focus. So the fur, why do I have the orange? Well, because brown alone isn't going to stand out enough against that skin tone. We need to have a color in there to make it pop. So, again, there's not a lot of fur. This is a pretty quick process, but what I did is work in the sepia ink and then just build up a little bit of the brown, build up a little bit of the orange, use the dark shade to work back in some deep shadows, and then just went back and forth a time or two with some of those midtones. And really, that's all it was. Fur is pretty straightforward and easy. I just used the orange to create some visual interest and to make the fur pop against the skin. Okay, so with that done, it's time to move to his strappy straps. Like many models, he has straps. I hate straps. Straps are the bane of my existence. I despise strappy straps on models, because they just never look right. They're so weird and difficult to paint to get them exactly clean. They're a small horizontal space. They're really annoying, and yeah, I don't like them. Anyway, what I decided to do here is just keep the straps in a simple gray tone, because I didn't want them to pop out. I'm gonna have plenty of color on here between the red the red clothing and the green armor, so the straps needed to stay neutral. And I wanted to do a gray to kind of cool out the piece and to have it fall in line with the steel in the long run. So here again, I've got a mix of various Scale 75 paints, and then I've got my dead white and my dark gray. So I'm keeping this monotone, like I didn't work any color into this. The real key when doing a lot of straps is to have clean lines, like it's all brush control. Because you start with your gray, you catch and then you want to catch in between each strap with a nice dark color. Now, for me, the Vallejo Model Wash dark gray is a savior here, because that stuff is basically liner. This is where we get back to our liner and having it be very useful. That stuff is really a lifesaver. It's going to work right in there. Once you get all the little straps picked out with those very dark shadows, then it's just a matter of smoothing out some light points. So I was creating like points of light, not necessarily a horizontal edge highlight, because that's false. That's not how things look. Light hits the strap vertically, you pick out your point of light, and then you diffuse the color out. It's cloth, so the transition needs to be very subtle and smooth, and so that's basically what I'm doing here, is just working those transitions over and over again. And you want to make sure as you're doing that, you never destroy your black liner that's in the middle. In other words, on his back, there's a strap that traces around. There's sort of a single point of light where it's caught, and then I diffused it out working down the line. Straps, again, were fairly quick because, well, by fairly quick, I mean, whatever. An hour or so, hour and a half to do the straps. Okay, so now we're moving on to the armor. And this is going to take a while. Because what I wanted to do here was go for a nice non-metallic metal turquoise armor scheme. So there's several different components that I need to do here. His bracers, his back armor, his head armor, that kind of thing. And then eventually I do the tail armor as well. This is using a set of paints out of the Scale 75 Shades of Doom paint set, which I'll probably do a product review of at some point in time because I quite like it. And then we're using our white glaze. You see there, I've got Vallejo white glaze right up front. Truly an amazing paint, by the way. If you want to do smooth blends, white glaze should be a tool in your arsenal. Pick some up. I rely on that about as often as I use my Vallejo dark gray model wash. Those two things are just, they're more or less a part of every figure I paint. So I started out by, of course, same thing. We're working the mid-tone here, right? Now, with the non-metallic metal effect, it's really all about, it's a complete study in light. And you need to figure out, it has to go from extremely dark, black, basically, right, out to white. Yeah, so like that whole distance I'm going to walk there has to go the whole way. Like I've got to take it from the bottom of that, black up to white, through all the color scheme in the middle. The other trick with doing a sort of a non-metallic metal green, and I'll probably do like turquoise armor as a tutorial at some point in time when you want to do this, is you got to have this sort of steel effect in there. And that only comes when you've got blues in there. Blue tricks the eye into seeing reflected metal. Reflective steel tends to reflect in a blue color. That's what our eye wants to see. So I'm going to glaze in that blue over and over again, which you see as the second highest color, right near the white. I'm going to keep a lot of that white into this sort of white-blue, and only the very, very edge and points are going to hit true white. Because again, you got to walk this whole distance, but you got to use the actual true black and true white in extremely minor amounts. You're going to use that blue, and we're going to use that dark gray-green to really take the majority of our space up and create the effect. So with each individual piece, like here what I'm doing is each plate individually. You notice I'm not really working my way around the model, right? Like when I did the skin, I worked my way around the model and glazed it in. You'll notice I've been sitting here banging on this one plate on his back. When you make these transitions, smoothness is the name of the game. And so I'm doing a lot of like quick wet blending and stuff like that. Scale 75 paints are great. They have like a bit of retarder in them, I suspect. Again, I don't know this for sure, but from the way they act, I would guess they do. And so you can, I add a little retarder medium myself. That's another thing sitting over on my palette. And I just am doing quick wet blends back and forth to do this. There's occasionally going to be a little loaded brush worked in there. If you want to see what I'm talking about with doing these various blending techniques, you can go back to Hobby Cheating, I think it's 33, where I talk about all the different blending methods. So, but now you'll notice I've moved to the other bracer. The bracer is a good example here. So the top half is, his arm is very cut, and he has those big spikes in the middle. So the top of it would be catching the light and reflecting toward the bottom point, right? Or like, that is to say, toward that center line, but also toward the lower center line. So you got to build your light toward that. And then whereas the underside would be cloaked in shadow, with the highest shadow up near the top of his arm, up near the elbow joint, right? So that's what I'm building toward. And I need to cut a soft, subtle transition between them, because I'm not doing like a sky earth non-metallic metal where there's a hard horizon line. So, light bounces off of everything. So there's no hard light lines where it suddenly cuts. It's not a point. It's not a blade edge, right? It's a smooth, round surface. So that edge needs to be subtle in its transition between the light and the dark, because it shouldn't cut like a hard line across it. There's nothing there that would behoove that. So now I'm just working the other bracer, same technique. And a lot of what I'm doing here is I'll build in the lighter color. Like I'll take and I'll way over highlight the lighter color. Like you can see how that looks right there. where it had that much lighter color. Then I'll go to my blue, and I'll bring that back down. So I'll glaze over it with the blue very thinly to knock most of that white out of there. Then I go to my green, and I knock some of that blue out of there. And I walk all the way back up to the dark and cut a slight dark line. And then I walk back down the other direction. Okay? There's just a lot of blending back and forth and back and forth. When you're trying to get that like sort of faked non-metallic metal experience, if you really want those smooth blends, you've got to work in a lot of glazes and things like that to keep all your color tone even, to keep things nice and smooth. There is sort of a level where you can go crazy with this, and if you can just kind of bang at it forever. If you get something under a microscope, you're always going to be able to see that the transitions aren't perfect. There's always going to be slight inconsistencies. That's okay. I try, you know, like this piece was for a competition, so I'm probably spending certainly more time than you would want to do. But this is, like I said, this is end-to-end display quality painting, right? So I'm trying to do everything to the absolute utmost of my ability on every piece. So here I'm up working on the helm. And the helm is an interesting example because, again, the way light catches on a lot of these sort of surfaces like that, when you've got a curved, swooping down surface, light's going to sort of catch along the lower edge line, right? That's where it's going to hit. And so then we're going to work the shadow up into the sort of underlayer of the next helm. So you can see how I'm just kind of cutting out some of my paint right out there. Even though I'm on a wet palette, this is taking a long time. So also there was time. These cuts sometimes have hours in between them. So I'm, again, even over that very small space, I need to work over not only all 6 of these colors. So, for example, he has a tiny little plate that's about the size of his ear, you know, right in front of his ear, right? That's got to have all 6 of those colors plus, you know, 50-50 blends in between worked into it to make it completely smooth and to show. So that's what I'm doing there, is just working each individual little plate. Just very, very carefully trying to get as smooth of a blend as I can on each one. And you can see there on that back plate that down at the lower part, we've got the white, and we just kind of slowly glaze it up, right? We slowly blend up. So here what I'm doing is, I didn't do each of his tail plates individually. I'm not that insane. So what I'm doing is I'm just doing one side of the tail plates at once. That seemed to be the easy way to go there. So again, just started by over highlighting at the point that would catch the light. So in this case, it's the sort of rear edge of that triangular shaped plate. And then I work in the blue, and then I work in the next turquoise down, and then the next down, and the next down, and then I get that black line very thin right at the edge. And then I just work my way back up. Okay? Still going. And by the way, as I continue to work this, the key with a lot of these is you've got to let the paint dry completely. Because, especially when you're working with white, when you apply it, looks much more vibrant than when it actually dries. Okay? So, it's always a good idea to let it dry completely, which, you know, even if it's touch dry, there's some amount of time that passes before it truly sets. And then go back and take a look at all your stuff. Because these plates were going to be the main focus of the figure for me, right? That is to say, as there's a lot of flesh tone on here. Like, by raw square millimeterage or whatever, there's probably more flesh than there is armor. But the flesh is a very neutral brown tone, right? Whereas the armor plates are this ultra bright turquoise with this white sharp edge. So what's going to happen when people's eyes hit this miniature is they're not going to really notice the flesh right away. They are going to notice the bright green armor. Bright colors attract the eye much, much, much better than any kind of neutral tone. So skin tones, flesh tones, browns, grays, all those things tend to fade into the background. Think next time you look at a miniature, really think about how you're looking at it and what colors you're actually seeing. Because my guess is you didn't notice all the neutral tones that just faded into the background. You don't notice the brown belts or something like that, right? You looked at the bright armor that was, in some color. You looked at the red tabard or the yellow or something like that. Like yellow is especially egregious in this way. It snaps your eyes to attention. So I'm just working it over and over again. All right, so turquoise armor done. Yeah, because what I did is every so often I would go back and just glaze out a transition if I happen to be in that color. So turquoise armor done. Now it's time to do the steel. So for this, we're using our Vallejo metal color metals. As usual, these are the only metal steel paints I utilize because everything else, every other steel paint that I have used, and I would say most other steel paints on the market, are utter garbage acrylic-wise. There are better paints in non-acrylic mediums, but they're really hard to use on miniatures of this size. Look, it's most time I say use whatever paint you want. I'm going to continue to repeat in every video that there is no paint in the world that I have ever used, and I've used more than a dozen different metal paints from 7 different miniature companies, and none of them are even close to this. Every other true metal color out there is garbage compared to this stuff that I have used. Now, okay, so product placement aside, which I don't get anything for that, I just truly believe in this product. I'm starting with just my mid-tone, or sorry, not my mid-tone. I'm starting with a fairly dark metal, which is my steel. That's actually the darkest of the 3. And there's a reason for that. Because the steel is just a nice tone to work from, and it's got to be the strongest color on there. My other colors up, which are dark aluminum and silver, as well as my blue, which is going to be a glaze in the middle to smooth everything out, or at the end, I should say, to smooth everything out, are going to be fairly minor players in this compared to the steel. So I start with a good base coat of that. Now, metal, I don't really do non-metallic metal painting because I don't like it very much. I don't think it actually looks like metal unless it's completely masterfully done. And even then, it's people who are at the top of the game who can make it look truly like metal. There's always a bit where it's just like, yeah, your brain knows that's not really metal. So I tend to favor true metallic metal paints done in a non-metallic metal style. That is to say, there's no reason we can't learn from what non-metallic metal taught us, which is that I can control still to some degree how the light interacts with the model. Because that's what we want. We do that with the rest of our miniature, with our matte paint. We are telling the viewer where the light is. That's why we place highlights. We're saying this is the point where light strikes. The problem with metal pigment is that it will change greatly how it reflects, depending on how it turns or where the light is. We can still control for that. So I start with my steel, and then I go to my black ink. So that's Scale 75 Inktensity Black, which is a fantastic paint for doing this sort of non-metallic metal, true metallic metal style. And I worked all the shadows into the blades, all the places where light wouldn't catch. I darkened that steel way down. Lots and lots of layers to get that black down. So we just glaze that ink in over and over and over and over again. We're not trying to get it all in one cut. I'll do 7, 8, 10, a dozen layers of that black, each time covering less and less to get down to just where it's super dark in the most shadowed places. Then what I'm doing is working my way up. I take that dark aluminum. I usually take the dark aluminum and like the silver onto the palette at the same time. Because this Vallejo metal color will tend to stay wet for a little while. And so you can apply one, go in with the higher one, get it on there, wipe your brush a little, smooth them together. And they blend like butter. Just so smooth. And you can start cutting that. Then I'll also usually get some of the original color, the steel, on my palette and start working that. At this point now, it becomes the same game as anything else. The Vallejo metal colors will blend just like any normal paint. They just tend to stay wet a little longer, so I can go back and forth and start smoothing out my blends. And what I was doing was with the dark aluminum and the silver, is creating the points where I want the light to reflect the brightest. So for example, on that blade on top of his head, the center point of the blade is where the light should catch. So I worked that up with some dark aluminum, then did some silver in the middle, smoothed out the edges with the steel, so on and so forth, right? So the goal is to get that transition up from that silver, which is going to reflect as white when light hits it, all the way down to pure black. It's a glossy black. So it still does have some reflection to it, but it's a glossy black. And but that's going to kill out and prevent most of the light from reflecting from there. So we can control still, to some degree, what is reflective and what isn't. We still get to own our shadows, even on metal paint, right? And that's the key there. What I'm doing here is just taking a lot of time to smooth it out. And then once I'm happy with that, we go to the Badger Ghost Tint Plasma Fluid. Oh, one of my favorite colors of all time. Like, it is one of the greatest paints in the universe. It has a very light skyish blue, and I took that, put it in my palette, and then got just a little bit of thinner medium and thinned it out. And now what I'm doing is just reworking those glazes in, and I put it in between the mid-tone, or the steel, basically over the mid-tone, and draw it up into the silver. Light glaze. I work it, again, you do 6 times, 7 times, 10 times of that glaze over the area, letting it dry each time, slowly building it up. And I usually draw it down away from the highlight into the shadow, because it's not going to do anything to the darker color. And this creates that blue steel sheen that gives some life to the metal, right? It also gives a bit of the idea of the reflection of sky or something like that. So metal, especially when held in an outside environment, because there's so much blue around if the sky is above you, will tend to have this very slight blue sheen to it. So that's why I like working in that blue. Now, you could do the same thing, by the way, with, say, brown or anything like that if you wanted more earthy metals. You don't have to use the blue. You could do the same thing with a brown color. All right, so the metal out of the way and the blue glaze in, we turn to the gold. There's not a huge amount of gold on him, but I needed a little to offset it, hilts of swords and things like that. It's not a big amount, a couple runes. Here I use a mix of Vallejo Metal Color copper and gold. I do 2 copper to 1 gold. That gives me a tone I really like. I've got the Vallejo Metal Color Pale Burnt Metal, which will be my highlight color for the gold. I mix that in slowly in there. Like, I cut a hard line with it, and then go back over with a thinned mix of my original, and then start mixing them together up into a highlight. That's basically the idea. You do everything in the mid-tone, you draw sort of your edge highlights with that pale burnt metal, which is very thin, and then, hence the pale in the name. And then I just start mixing in mid-tones and smoothing it all out. At the same time, I create my shadows on gold with Scale 75 chestnut ink and purple ink. I start by creating, in the same way I did it with the metal, I'm creating the shadows with the sepia, and then I'm creating my deep shadows with a mix of the sepia and the purple, and the very deepest lines with just the purple. And then in the end, we go back and we smooth it all out again with that mid-tone. So going up and down, right? Again, if you want to see an explanation of that technique, I believe Hobby Cheating 27 talks about doing non-metallic metal, true metallic metal gold. Okay, so there was that. That gold done, I turned to bone. This guy doesn't have a huge amount of bone on him. He's got some fingernails, he's got these toofies, and he's got some spines coming off his tail. You can see we've got a huge amount of colors here. My base color is going to be Vallejo Model Color Buff. That's what I'm going to use to. It's a nice, strong base tone. I'm going to use that to kind of cut everything out. Here, what I'm doing is just sort of prepping some paint, looking at the model, making sure I have everything captured accurately. Like I often have to stare at a model a little while, especially with these little tiny details, to make sure I'm actually hitting everything. So the idea was put some buff on everything, and then we start working down our shadows. So we start with a little Seraphim Sepia. We kind of go over everything, pretty much coat the bone in that, but always pulling it towards the darker parts, so toward the base of the spine, toward the tip, the gum area of the teeth, all those sorts of things. We want it to be darkest near the base of the bone. Once that's done, I then thinned out some sepia ink and intensified the shadows in each bone. So each little spine, is going to get a hit of the darkest dark of that sepia ink, right? Once that's all done, we then start going the other direction. So we use some Vallejo Model Air Ivory and Aged White, both of which I like. They're very subtle tones, they thin fairly easily. Here you can see I'm applying the Seraphim Sepia, by the way, to everything. One of the few things I'll use straight out of the pot is the Citadel Shades. And I think they're fine out of the pot for most of what I'm doing. I don't tend to wash a whole model. I use them to just create shadows or something like that on very particular colors. So once all these deep shadows are created, then we start picking out the highlights with the ivory, and then ivory, aged white mix, and then up to completely aged white. Then I take some of the sepia and some of the mid-tone, and I recreate and I smooth the middle. Because in the end, you want it to have a slight brownish tone to them, or I wanted to in this particular case. I did want some very subtle browns in there. And then we're back to that calamari orange. You can see it just hanging out there down at the end. It's the secret weapon, I'm telling you. Calamari orange from Scale 75. It's truly just an amazing color for working things in. Because then the final step with doing that bone is to take a very thin glaze of that calamari orange and work it into all the bones. It creates a bit of vibrancy, color, and intensity to your brown tones. You don't go over the highlights with it. You just kind of cover the very, let's say we're talking about a tooth. And so it moves over this massive transition from the dark sepia out to near white, okay, at the bottom. In which case you're going to take that calamari orange and you're going to glaze it in from about 2/3 back up to the darkest color. Again, you always pull that glaze toward the darkest color. Okay. And if you want to see an explanation on that, I don't remember the video number, but I have an explanation for how I do that sort of 6 or 7 tone bone to get that all captured in there. There's a hobby cheating video for that as well. Okay, so with the bone done, we turn to actually finishing the tail. So as I said, I had tried to buy myself a lot of time by constantly applying color in various places how I liked it, where I saw it was appropriate with the tail. So that set me up with the tail to just kind of then smooth it and finish it out. So here I'm going back to my flesh tones, but I'm going to rely much heavier on that Indian shadow, right? The goal being to make sure that I'm turning the tail slightly more ruddy than the rest of the model. And that is the key. Ruddy, not pink, okay? Pink is cartoony and silly on rats' tails. It's just going to stand out, especially if you've got muted tones, as I do here on the rest of the model. So I'm working that shadow in very naturally, trying to focus my shadows on the undersides of the tail and using heavier mixes of that Indian shadow to just tint everything more toward that crimsonish spectrum, right? Keeping it in that, keeping it so it looks like a more ruddy version of the flesh. Now, the other thing I did at this point, by the way, is, since I had done the flesh first, in painting everything else, of course, what happened is, every so often there'd be a mistake. That is to say, something would get messed up. I'd get a little tiny dab of paint, and even if I wipe it immediately, you still don't really get all of it away. So I'm just also using this point. The reason I saved the tail for last is because I knew that it would let me go back to my flesh tones at the very end and smooth out and fix any tiny little errors, things I had noticed throughout the rest of painting the model, mistakes I had made. It sort of kept me moving. You always want to do everything in the most efficient way possible, and so this was sort of, I saved the tail for the last step to also then correct any issues. Okay. One quick step here, I took some Scale 75 Intensity Red ink. I had done the eyes just in the sort of ivory color, put a white dot in the middle like a true white, and then I hit it with the red ink, and that gives that inner glow of glowing red eyes. So with the rat done, it's time to make the base. So I knew I wanted him to be jumping down from this weird high, like I wanted him way up. I wanted a big old base. And I wanted him to be like, he's leaning in like he's about to assassinate someone, so I wanted him kind of angled slightly, like he was about to jump down. I'm just getting some super glue, I'm using cork, and just building up this big stalactite of cork. Or, sorry, stalagmite. Tight to the ceiling, might be on the ground. So I wanted this double stalagmite, so it didn't just look like one weird rock standing up. It had to be two. I needed one big one and one small one, because that's what sort of sells the illusion. Next thing up, we grab our spackle paste, and we're just going to grab a little stick, and you're seeing I'm just sort of applying it all over the place, and then I use my finger to smooth it out, push it into the various recesses. Same thing, apply a big dab, use your finger to push it in. This is a messy process, but the spackle paste is so good for creating this natural rock texture over this cork, because you're going to get those natural bumps and everything from the cork. You want to lean into that. It gives you a very natural, weird, water-worn underground cave look. There's a sort of an old man's caverns in my state, and so I've been there, and that's the kind of texture you get when water runs over them for a while. You get this weird texture. Next up, I'm taking two different texture pastes from Vallejo. One is like marble white, and one is the gray pumice that I've product reviewed before, and I'm just kind of working those in. Now, the marble white is to sort of create some horizontal sheens to the rock. The paste, the gray pumice, I'm actually going to turn into moss. So, I skipped some steps there of just base coating because it was all airbrush stuff, but I basically just zenithal the whole thing in the airbrush booth. Nothing mysterious about it. Again, having the camera in the airbrush booth to show you zenithal highlighting wouldn't be a very good use of your time. But there was some time and work in there and various washes and things that happened. Then I just started dry brushing. What I'm doing here basically is, if you look at the hobby cheating where I talk about preparing your best miniature, that's what I'm doing. So then I'm just working in all the colors, finishing everything out to get the stone ready, and then once the stone's done, my next step was to just weather it all out. And that's what I did. Put on all my greens, weathered all the stone out with lots of washes. Again, you can go back to hobby cheating at the beginning of this week, attached him with glue, and there you go. He's all done.